It's one of the most iconic games of all time. It brought Japanese RPGs to the West in a way in which we've never seen before. And even over 20 years later, its legacy simply refuses to die. A game that fans loved so much that it even had to be remade. This is the Night Sky Prince, and today we're going to be diving into the development history of Final Fantasy VII. The year is 1994, and a Japanese company named Squaresoft had built their entire empire on the Famicom and Super Famicom systems. Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy III as it became known in the United States, was released for the Super Nintendo, meeting huge critical acclaim. During the development of this game, the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi's mother, died, which led him on a path to begin writing concepts around a game that had a core theme centered around life, seeking a more logical way to resolve his grieving. From there, the next numbered iteration of Final Fantasy had begun development for the Super Nintendo as another 2D sprite game. However, another team at Squaresoft would come to have tremendous trouble developing another title, Chrono Trigger. With Chrono Trigger having a tough time getting out of the door for a proper release, many of Final Fantasy VII staff, including Yoshinori Kitase, were pulled to work on Chrono Trigger. This delay left Final Fantasy VII's development resuming in late 1995. Looking back at the sprite-based concept game the team had made, Kitase was worried about the franchise being left in the dust by the competition if it didn't utilize 3D graphics. At SIGGRAPH that year, they showed off a technical demonstration utilizing Final Fantasy VI characters called Final Fantasy SGI. At this point in time, it was assumed that the next entry would be developed for Nintendo 64. Tests were being made for the Nintendo 64 version of the game, which would use the planned 64DD peripheral, even in the face of a lack of development kits and changing hardware specs. Due to the lack of the necessary development kits, Square had to start running tests early to gauge the specifications of the game. Nintendo, in turn, provided emulation kits of the 64 in order for Square to accurately gauge performance. And from the early tests, things were looking pretty bad. Squaresoft found themselves unable to make their vision of a 3D Final Fantasy game come to life with the planned specifications of the Nintendo 64. It was determined early that at least 2,000 polygons would be needed to render the series famous behemoth monster, and so far it would cause low frame rates and poor performance on Nintendo's next generation hardware. Square curiously began to look at competitor machines including Sony's PlayStation, personal computers, and yes, even the Sega Saturn, as it looked increasingly impossible to make a Final Fantasy game on the 64. While Nintendo 64 did have some advantages like texture filtering, which left textures appearing less pixelated than PlayStation games, it wasn't particularly good at pushing out high polygon models or high resolution textures. On paper, the Nintendo 64 certainly looks more powerful, but that's just on the surface. The 64 had a problematic bottleneck that it only had 4 kilobytes of texture memory, which compared to the PlayStation, which had 1 megabyte of dedicated video memory, a variable amount that could be dedicated to textures or anything else that the developers wanted. The consequence of this design was that textures had to be extremely compressed to work on the 64, and while Nintendo previously promised that the 64 would be able to render 1 million polygons per second, only 100,000 polygons per second were actually possible, compared to the Sony PlayStation, which rendering 180,000 polygons per second was possible, which is nearly double what the 64 was offering. Then there was the matter of fitting the game onto 64 cartridges. When we discussed designing the field as illustrations or CG based, we came up with the idea of eliminating the connection between the movies and the fields. Without using blackout at all and maintaining quality at the same time, we would make the movie stop at one cut and make the characters move around on it. We tried to make it controllable even during the movie scenes. As a result, using a lot of motion data plus CG effects and in-still images, it turned out to be a mega capacity game, and therefore we chose CD-ROM as our media. In other words, we became too aggressive and got ourselves in trouble. Hironobu Sakaguchi. It was estimated that it would have required 30 64DD discs to run Final Fantasy VII properly. It would have been impossible to develop a game this massive on anything other than a CD-ROM. I was hired by the president of the company, Mizuno-san, and he told me that Squaresoft will always be with Nintendo. As long as you work for us, it's basically the same thing as working for Nintendo. In the week after I joined, they started saying, oh, maybe we should switch to Sony. I was kinda shocked. Yoshihiro Maruyama. Squaresoft internally wrestled with the decision to switch their iconic Nintendo-built franchise over to Sony PlayStation, but there was no turning back now. The PlayStation not only met all their hardware demands, but after having their backs turned on them by Nintendo, the next step seemed obvious. In meeting with Nintendo, they tried to discuss the problem with them directly. However, their concerns would be met with a shut door. You're going to need a CD-ROM drive for it. You don't have enough bandwidth to do what we're trying to do. And with what you have now, we're not going to be able to make an RPG. But Yamauchi-san at Nintendo basically refused to listen to any of it. That's when Sakaguchi-san and the management team at Square decided, okay, we're going with Sony now. Shinichiro Kajitani. With Nintendo doubling down on its decision to use cartridges for their next console, Square and Nintendo would have to end their long relationship. Sony, excited to convert Squaresoft, even offered them a lower royalty rate than other companies just to sweeten the deal. So on January 12, 1996, Squaresoft announced they would be developing Final Fantasy VII exclusively for Sony's PlayStation. And in order to announce the game was switching platforms in a world that was still adapting to internet usage, much less internet marketing, a TV commercial was used in Japan to announce the platform switch, and an ad was placed in Shonen Jump magazine, which had 6 million readers at the time. With PlayStation chosen for the next Final Fantasy game, it allowed Squaresoft to achieve their dream of CG graphics incorporated with real-time graphics. However, it would require a huge jump in resources. They would be using one of the largest development teams ever seen in the industry at that point, a massive project requiring 120 artists and programmers, an absolutely absurd number of people at a time where most games were being made by a team of 20. Hironobu Sakaguchi chose Tetsuya Nomura to design characters for Final Fantasy VII. He believed Nomura's manga art style would be more compatible with the polygon designs required by the 3D graphics of the PlayStation. This would be how Nomura would go on to be one of the most well-known character designers in the video game industry. Squaresoft purchased over 200 Indigo 2 machines at $70,000 apiece, an Onyx server which cost about $1 million, a challenge server which cost about $500,000, for a total of around $17 million on SGI equipment, with PlayStation development kits costing around $20,000 apiece. Thus, it would go on to be one of the most expensive video games ever developed, with a budget of $45 million and a marketing budget of $100 million. With inflation for 2017, that's equivalent to $217 million in budget, still ranking Final Fantasy VII as the third most expensive game ever developed to this day, sitting only behind GTA 5 and Modern Warfare 2. This massive budget would be required to implement Squaresoft's vision of incorporating CG graphics into the game, using state-of-the-art tools such as Power Animator and Soft Image 3D software. With this ambitious multi-million-dollar project underway, it begs the question, how did this project manage to come together? What made Final Fantasy VII the success it is today? Find out in part 2 of the development history of Final Fantasy VII. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe so you can know as soon as part 2 comes out. In the meantime, I highly recommend joining our Facebook group, ULTIMA, Square Enix plus JRPGs. We talk non-stop about Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, and things other groups wouldn't dare talk about. Check us out in the description below.